Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the MSCG webinar on supply chain disruption caused by the coronavirus and other factors. This is a 60-minute session with about 45 minutes of presentation and 15 minutes of Q&A. Just for everyone's information, this is a recorded session. Please be on mute as a courtesy to other participants during the presentation. Feel free to post your questions on chat and we will get it during the 15 minutes of Q&A. With that said, I will hand you over to Dan to run through the agenda for today. Over to you, Dan.
Yeah. Thanks, Amir. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thanks, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are. Quickly, the agenda, we will go through the introductions of the two speakers here, and then we will start looking into the supply chain disruptions aspects of what is happening, why it's happening, how long we think the disruptions are going to last and their impact. Then we will go through specifics of three key scenarios and how companies can handle those situations of disruption and the kind of mitigation strategies that they can employ to mitigate their risk. And toward the end, we will then also discuss the My Supply Chain Group's methodology of agile assessment and action plan to counter these disruptions in a significant manner with short-term, mid-term, long-term plans for them. Next slide, please. My name is Dan Bhide. I am the co-founder and partner at My Supply Chain Group with more than 30 client engagements over the past 20 years. Odell, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hey, my name is Odell Smith. I have, thanks to all of you guys for being here today. I have about 30 years of supply chain business and IT experience, 20 years, over 20 years of developing advanced supply chain planning tools in several different verticals, and I have 11 years here with my supply chain group. I'm a supply chain architect and delivery partner.
Thanks, Odell. You know, several of our key subject matter experts have provided inputs for this, and we want to acknowledge the contribution of Samir, Himanshu, Mahesh, and Sanjay in putting this overall deck together. Thanks to them that we are able to present this today to all of you. Next slide, please. Just a quick one-pager introduction about My Supply Chain Group. We are a premier enterprise consulting firm that offers innovative solutions in the supply chain strategy, process reengineering, and applications integration arena across multiple industry verticals. We were founded in 2008, have been around now for 12 years with the head office in the US and also subsidiaries in Canada, Mexico, and Asia Pacific. As a company, we have had more than 60 clients so far, and we are growing rapidly with 160 consultants all over the world, majority of them in the US, but also with consultants in, like we said, Canada, Latin America, Australia, India, and so on. When it comes to our services, we go beyond the supply chain strategies to also help companies with their supply chain diagnostics to do the roadmap development for the long-term programs that they would have in place, process ranging and process optimization aspects. And we are known for our global rollouts and implementations. We also do application maintenance services. As I said earlier, we focus on multiple industry verticals. The key ones for us have been the consumer products, food and beverage, oil and gas, chemicals, life sciences, pharma, high-tech, aerospace and defense, manufacturing, and so on. And our key solution offerings are related to supply chain planning. Within that, we do in terms of solutions, SAP supply chain solutions like integrated business planning and advanced planning and optimization. We also have extensive expertise with planning capabilities in S/4HANA for production planning, detailed scheduling, available to promise, and so on. We also have a rapidly growing practice in supply chain execution with focus on embedded and core extended warehouse management, transportation management, yard logistics, and so on. In addition, we also have a significantly growing practice now on predictive analytics and business warehousing and so on. In terms of why MSCG, we have always been known for our seasoned leadership, for very innovative thought leadership and innovative solutions, focus on high quality and cost effective solutions. We are known for our risk mitigation and value maximization skill set that many industry clients have benefited from. And we always uh, bring best practices from across multiple industry verticals relevant to the clients. Next slide, please. Let's look at the what, why, when kind of aspects of the disruption that all of us are going through right now. Next slide. We all are at the suffering end of this corona virus pandemic that is now a global pandemic. As we all know, over around the world, there have been more than 40,000 deaths already, more than 800,000 people infected. In the US alone, more than 2,000 deaths and more than 120,000 people infected. Unfortunately, the experts in this field say that these numbers are going to keep doubling every 4 to 7 days. So there is a real concern that around the globe, these numbers will increase very rapidly. There is also the US-China trade war and tensions that have been going around for the last more than a year or two. In fact, if the companies had already started working or acting on these trade war-related tensions to diversify their supply chains, maybe they are suffering less at this point in time from the disruptions from this COVID-19 global pandemic than those who probably had not. There is also, as we all see, a major problem with the crash in oil demand, and that's reflected in the prices because of the lack of demand and with the glut of oil supplies. As of yesterday night, the Brent crude was down to around $26 a barrel, something that we hadn't seen for many years. And many of the stock indices around the globe have declined anywhere between 15 to 35%. And all these fears combined together, this confluence of all these multiple factors is giving rise to fears about the impending recession. So COVID is the big trigger. There are multiple other factors that also have been shaping this up over the last several months and maybe a couple of years. Many of the experts, because of this, are describing this something like a once in a blue moon black swan event. What they say is a black swan event is when something is extremely unpredictable, not discernible from the past patterns, has a very severe and widespread impact, and the consequences are such that people then tend to rationalize this as having been predictable, but only with the benefit of the bias of hindsight. So this is what we are all dealing with. Most people had not anticipated the level of disruption that we are all experiencing right now. And that's what we are going to talk about in the next few slides as well. Next slide, please. Let's look at the financial impact of this. They say that the world economy will contract by about 1 to 3% during this pandemic or during this situation that we are all in. And if 1 to 3% doesn't sound like a large number, realize that even in the 2007 through 2009 global financial crisis, the world economy had shrunk by barely 0.1%. So it's a very massive contraction of the global economy that we will be dealing with. In the US alone, the Treasury Secretary himself has estimated that there will be a contraction of about 24 to 30% of the US GDP for the second quarter alone. And the unemployment rates are expected to rise to somewhere in the range of 13 to 20%. So this is nothing to scoff at, a very serious situation that we are all dealing with. And unfortunately, because of people being locked down, the short-term and mid-term shock to the demand having gone down for a lot, majority of products, is going to have a more severe impact on the economy than the short-term supply shock that we are experiencing on many of the items. Companies like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs are even claiming that the global recession is already underway. And the financial shock that poor are going to, all of us, but especially poor, are suffering through, may even create a second economic pandemic followed by this health pandemic. So that is indeed a serious concern. Uh, Coronavirus pandemic has, unlike many other shocks in the past, delivered the fastest and deepest economic shock in the history. And this unprecedented combined effect of what we see as the demand shock, the supply shock, and financial shock is going to have impact for a very extensive foreseeable future. Next slide, please. When it comes to disruptions on the supply chains or across the supply networks of companies, 75+% of US companies, and I would imagine it's a fairly similar number or even more around the world, have been severely impacted by all of these shocks. And many of these companies are also therefore lowering the revenue targets. A very large percent, 40+% of companies really do not have the kind of plans that were needed to handle this kind of disruptions that are being faced by all of us world over. And just to give you an example, in the last few weeks alone, the freight charges have gone up by 15%, and they will have their ripple effect across the global supply network, just as many other factors will have a bullwhip effect of their impact as well. It has indeed been a wake-up call for supply chain management. Companies always claim to have risk mitigation strategies, but now they don't seem to be sufficient. The CEO of Target said, hey, no, there is no playbook. We are writing the script each and every day on the fly, which also means the ability to respond to new situations on the fly. It becomes very crucial, and we'll talk a bit more about this kind of on the fly what if planning capabilities that companies need later as well. Fortunately, it seems like the production China has slowly tried to catch up again on its original production capabilities. They have started to rebound, and we have started seeing an increase in the shipments out of China again. So while China was the first to experience this pandemic, it seems to be coming out now. So that may ease up the disruptions to some extent, but again, it's going to be a while before the disruptions can bring us to what we are now thinking that will be a new normal for all of us. Next slide, please. When we look at why is the impact so severe, one would realize that there have been some trends that have been in the play for the last 2 or 3 decades, and those trends have now made the recent disruptions to concoct a mix that is extremely hazardous for us all. If you look at the fact that over the last 2-3 decades, companies have talked about and enacted strategic sourcing. What that means was the cost-driven decisions to deal with fewer and fewer suppliers in more concentrated geographies meant that whenever those regions or those suppliers are going through a disruption, they will have a disproportionate impact on the overall networks. There has also been this initiative towards the outsourcing and lean manufacturing over the last 2-3 decades, which meant that there is only very limited capability available locally or internally within a company to expand their internal production capabilities when the situation so requires, as is the case now. And also, many companies have enabled just-in-time inventory for all of their raw materials, finished goods, and so on, or trading goods. What that means is they are very low on buffer stock wherever they're nearer their customer base. And while they had forced the vendors to keep maybe extra inventories, that inventory now cannot be brought quickly enough to where the customer bases are. So there is a significant misalignment between inventory at the customer regions versus inventory at the supplier regions, not reaching the customer regions because of this disruption. Now, these long-term trends are meeting the 3 new disruptions that we are experiencing. The disrupted networks mean that there are significant production shutdowns, there are regional lockdowns, people can't even get to work. Even if they can get to work, they may not have enough other facilities, raw materials available, for example, and that's leading us into a disrupted supply situation where we can't have enough of the input materials or enough of the trading materials available in the customer regions. And also there is a disruption of demand because of the lockdown, people are not able to go out and spend money. There is a run on certain products like masks and sanitizers and devices, but there is also a glut of oil and gas. But then there is a shortage of many other things that we are all experiencing. The toilet paper being just an example of the kind of severe shortages and empty shelves that many of us have seen around in our grocery markets, for example. So essentially, these decades-old trends are meeting the short-term demand, supply, and economic shocks, and that is what's creating this fear of recession. Next slide, please. The logical question all of us are asking is, when will normalcy be restored? When will I be able to go out and get back to the normal? As we said, there will be a new normal. I doubt that we will be able to get back to what we pursued as the normal just a few months ago. As we all know, the health crisis itself is going to take weeks, if not even months, to resolve. And even after the health crisis is resolved, then the disruption that we have experienced through the supply chains are also going to take again weeks, if not months, for us to comprehend and stabilize and recover from. And the reason for that is the priming of the pump to get the economy jump started, to remove the choked, the choke nodes of the supply networks is going to be a very time consuming and excruciatingly complex thing to deal with. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is warning that this global economic hit from this coronavirus pandemic is going to be felt for a long time, for multiple quarters, possibly a couple of years or longer, to all of us to recover out of. What that means is, while all of us are struggling with and dealing with these short-term disruptions, the disruptions may continue into the midterm and long term, and that means we will need to now have strategies to go beyond the short-term firefighting to look into the midterm and long-term aspects of how do we prepare ourselves to the new normal. And that is where the strategy, the action plans, and the continued reassessments of those action plans is going to become very crucial. Next slide, please. So I will hand it over to Odell now, and he will take us through the kind of three major significant disruptions we talked about: the demand shock, the supply shock, and the supply network disruptions. And he will take us through several examples. Over to you, Odell.
Okay, thanks much, Dan. Appreciate that. First, I'd like to, as Dan mentioned earlier, we have a lot of supply chain subject matter experts in our organization, and several of those guys worked on putting this presentation together for us. So wanted to give a shout out to those guys. Appreciate that. And then these industry verticals that we have all of this different expertise in help to shape a lot of these solutions that we provide to these different clients. So what we're going to do, this is not going to be a demo, but it's rather going to kind of be a process overview. It's system agnostic, and we're going to look at the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about how to contact us for details on free demos and evaluation services that we can put in place to help rapidly respond to some of these disruptions. So we're going to look at three specific supply chain issues: disrupted supply networks, and then we're going to look at some situations where we have some supply shortages, where we got this excess demand all of a sudden. And then we're going to look at the inverse of that, where we got some supply excess, and what some of the things that can cause issues with supply excess would be as well. So this first issue that this slide is on is about disruptions in the network, and this could be for raw material or finished goods supply from vendors or contract manufacturing. It could also be in something related to outbound logistics, getting your product to your end customer. So there's kind of a perfect storm of disruptive forces that are hitting each one of these companies' supply chains at the same time. And as Dan mentioned, it's not something that's ever been experienced here before on a global scale with all of these vectors coming together. So there's a supply shock with manufacturing and shipping crippled from some of the overseas manufacturing suppliers, specifically China, since they were the first ones hit, and they shut down their entire country to support this right during the middle of that of the Chinese New Year. And so that obviously sent a supply shock through the rest of the supply chains before anybody else started even experiencing this. And then you've on the other side, you've got these demand shocks where some customers' business just completely dried up. Restaurant food distribution is one example, or the airlines are another example, while others skyrocketed. Our friends in the paper and pulp industry couldn't produce enough toilet paper and still can't. And then in addition, there's other things like expedite cost increases, right? Where you've got demand and supply that are not matching, and you have to expedite things. Then there's also a situation where you've got government intervention and border and port closures because of the health and safety issues that are going on with, and that effectively reduces capacity. So next slide, please. So what we're going to do is we have a couple of slides on each one of these issues, and I kind of just wanted to do this layout for you real quick. We're going to be looking at some issues and their impact, and then some mitigation strategies, and then a little bit of some possible action plans that you can put in place to address those strategies. And then what we'll do in the next slide is we'll drill down into some details on one specific example and just show you what some things are that we have seen before and that we're currently helping customers with. And these obviously are going to be client and disruption-specific solutions that we're going to have to address. So they're very flexible, but just to give you an example of how we can address those. So in our disrupted network scenario here, we've got a situation where we've got some port closures, like I mentioned, for health and safety, as well as just government reasons. We're going to have to evaluate that transport network and see if there are alternatives that might be in place for us to do that. And we actually are currently helping one of our existing customers deal with just this exact situation because of the COVID shutdowns. It's affected their capability to transport materials. And so they're looking at doing simulations and being able to drive some of those decisions via simulation, where they can estimate what the cost impact of that's going to be before they make that decision. And it's provided great value to them. Another example are price changes, where we're going to make proactive decisions about cost absorption, or being able to actually raise the price to the end customers. Being able to use scenario planning to make those decisions about that elasticity of demand and how to get that competitive advantage are really important. And then increased lead times is another big impact. And having to try to proactively manage vendor and customer shipments, being able to use alerts and dashboards for evaluating your critical components and your A products, those likely will change. And so being able to reevaluate the future product mix and requirements when the demand of your products change drastically during one of these disruptions is another thing that can help you focus on the critical products and any lead time adjustments that are having to be put in place because of that. An example here in the shelf space area is with this increased demand of toilet paper. It requires so much warehouse space for these big packages that in some cases, that impact of that would require you to maybe increase shipment frequency, where you would normally only make a couple of shipments from the DC out to the stores a week. Now you may have to schedule one a day in order to be able to keep the shelves full, and then also have availability for the other products that are required in your transportation network. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we have here, if you'll focus on this, on the blue and the green, we've kind of already covered in this supply disruptions, we've covered the impact and the mitigation strategy. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus here on the action plan and the specific tasks that support that action plan. And we're just going to focus on this route determination based on port constraints. So the capability of being able to put in short-term, medium-term, and long-term action plans and tasks that support that action plan is important, because as Dan mentioned, we don't know how long this is going to last. So being able to evaluate the risk and then determine what might be a short-term plan action, what might be a medium-term, and what might be a long-term is important to be able to estimate where you need to focus your limited resources. So that's what we're gonna kind of focus on, some different options here. So doing optimization in a version simulation for these different port options is in the margin analysis that uses these additional transport costs has allowed, like I said, in one of our existing clients, has allowed them to be able to make these difficult customer allocation rules for constrained supply. And the only way you're really able to do that is to be able to do scenario planning with these different costs, and to be able then to collaborate with your customers and make the decisions that are necessary for them to be able to keep their operations going. Based on these scenario planning results, then we're going to come out of that with some updates, possibly to some master data, some transactional data where we're looking at maybe changing our forecast or our container volumes. We could possibly put in new configuration that looks at some different forecasting methods, and you can always look in a more long-term, possibly even addressing in your process re-engineering piece of addressing your sourcing policy and processes based on that what-if analysis. So again, remember, if you've got any specific questions about these tasks, just put them in the chat, and then we'll take a look at those, and we're logging those, and we'll address those at the end of the session. So next slide, please. So another serious issue is a supply shortage issue, which we've kind of alluded to previously. And this can be from a sudden increase in demand, or it could be a constraint that's been generated by a logistics network like we just discussed, or a manufacturing shutdown, which is like what's happened to a lot of the companies where they've single sourced their products out of China, and China was shut down. So as Dan mentioned earlier, we're all familiar with the push over the last 20 plus years to move lots of the manufacturing over to lower cost areas. And this has had an impact as the shutdown kind of started in Asia. This has had a huge impact on a lot of customers and businesses. So the timing of this outbreak is devastating for a lot of companies that depend on this winter production to meet their seasonal summertime demand, especially in the West here, where a pre-build is required, and then that was not able to be done. So having supply shortages obviously can affect your purchase finished goods, but it can also affect a single raw material product could wind up affecting an entire network of finished goods that are dependent on that raw material. There's a lot of industries that are having these supply constraints, from everything from food products to medical products, consumer electronics, automotive, and even the mining industry is having a significant decrease in output. Next slide, please. So the supply shortage is probably the most common issue in this particular, in this disruption, just because of a lot of the factors that we've already discussed. Raw material and purchase finished goods can make most of these cancellations or delays. So there are several different mitigation strategies that you can put in, and there's some short-term, medium-term, and long-term assessments that need to be made. Vendor diversification, as this first bullet here is probably the one of the most critical, but it's not really probable to do that for in the short term unless you have pre-approved suppliers in many cases. Most of these companies have, you know, highly engineered products, and you would have to have multiple suppliers approved ahead of time. So if in the medium term you can get those approved suppliers in place, in the medium term, that's a great mitigation strategy. But in the short term, about the only thing you can do with that is to activate any pre-approved suppliers that you might have, and then quickly take a look at their supply chain and how they're going to be able to support you in this initiative. Longer term, the vendor collaboration for business continuity is important to be able to work together as a holistic chain. Is really important, so that you know immediately what the capabilities are of your entire network, all the way through from the suppliers to the customer. So another example here of a mitigation strategy is to evaluate your product. So you can have product substitutions that you can put in the short term for raw materials. In many cases, you can substitute, in some cases, a higher cost material that can be substituted temporarily to get you out of a bind, but there's going to be a margin impact to that. And so one of the things to do, we'll talk about in a minute, is to simulate these substitutions to see what the margin impact is going to be, and be able to make a decision about that and how that's going to affect your margins. If you have to supply this to a customer and you're losing money on it, it might be okay to do for a period of time, but it won't be sustainable in the long run. Then in the medium term and the long term, you know, adjust this, attempt to balance this just-in-time solution that reduces cost with a just-in-case process that Dan has discussed, where you'll try to minimize your working capital, but be able to be more resilient at the same time. So reevaluating the supplier and the product portfolio and focusing on these, evaluating these materials that are going to be critical to your business process is the most important thing that you can do. Being able to have visibility for the network and the potential issues that you're going to experience is critical to being able to make predictive decisions. And so having great dashboard capability and alert capability to specifically hone in on things that are important and get rid of the noise is the best mitigation strategy. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look specifically at activating this, at activating the secondary approved vendors that were already in place, and some of the tasks that might be necessary to be able to activate that action plan. So in the supplier diversification, we're going to need to execute some scenario planning to evaluate the vendor capacity of these alternate suppliers, and then collaborate with those vendors to make sure that they're going to be able to support you, because they may have other crisis things that they're working on as well. So being able to take a few simulations to them and collaborate with them is really the most important thing that you can do. And once you have evaluated that, then you're going to go and actually put that into place and be able to make sure that it works with your simulation by changing some master data, updating some transactional data, and possibly some configuration of giving some new adjustments. And then be able to look at the long-term, medium-term, and short-term, short-term, medium-term, and long-term impacts to putting that process in place. And there's even process engineering things that you can do in the long term, that you might decide to realign your buyer roles from a region-centric to a product-centric scenario in order to be able to long-term handle these type of disruptions. Next slide, please. Okay, so this last one is about the demand drop or excess supply, and a prime example of that is what Dan mentioned earlier about Russia's plan to put the U.S. shale producers out of business and flood the market with oil. So this just happened, and it caused a dynamic drop in the price of oil, which caused production to slow, but at the same time, there was a push to try to gain market share by Russia and Saudi Arabia, and when they did that, they've kind of flooded the market with oil, and so it's not this in this example. The world is going to potentially run out of places to put this oil, with this big push being to gain market share and drop the prices. With that comes along the fact that some of these production facilities you can't just go and flip a big black switch and shut that thing down. It takes time to be able to ramp it down, and then once you ramp it down, it will not be able to pick back up and produce again. So if this is a short-term V type of a scenario and things crank back up again, then some of these facilities take months to be able to ramp production back up again, because of lots of different things that have to happen, including heating up the storage of the production facilities. So it just adds to increased volatility that's going to go through this in this example. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at the price crash and evaluate some hedge consumptions. And hedging is a process that that a lot of companies do when they're dealing with raw materials that are commodities, and they have there's a lot of price volatility with those. And in a situation like this where you have a price crash, then you can have a short-term mitigation strategy to do spot purchases that could be a lot cheaper for your raw material. And then in medium term, you might choose to do reposition some of your hedge commitments for future months based on what your evaluation is and your simulations tell you to do. And then in the longer term, you could even work with your customers and evaluate their requirements that are going to affect your hedge positions in the future. So our increased production costs for storage is another significant impact that you have to evaluate when you're dealing with something like this, where you possibly would go out and purchase some extra and put into case push production to be able to move some of these rail cars and the demurrage that's being incurred. So you have to kind of balance that. So in the short term, you would try to put in some simulation to be able to see what your storage cost is going to be. And it might be cheaper for you to buy the oil cheaper, pay demurrage, and be able to have extra supply to be able to build more product that you know you're going to use in the future. And you can simulate here to be able to decide if that's the right thing to do. Being able to do, to evaluate your financial hedges and compare those to your gallons of production, then is really important and can help you maybe even in the medium or long term to decide to do more wet gallon purchases versus financial hedges. Looking at the cash flow requirements that would be required to do spot purchases and put in some push production can also be a mitigation strategy. Next slide, please. So doing these hedges, we're going to look now at this hedge short-term action plan and look at some of the things that we can do, some specific tasks, how we can address that. So I have over 15 years of experience doing different hedging in different industries, and that it affects so many different industries in the raw materials in many cases. In some cases, that's the finished good output, but being able to see the impact that is had on these commodities by these disruptions is really important. And then being able to take that and look at simulate the scenarios that can come out of that and make decisions that's going to maximize your margin is very, very important. And so in some cases, the commodity raw material is 70+ % of the total finished goods price. So being able to rapidly evaluate and adjust the future hedges as well as making spot market decisions is really important. And the only way that you can really do that is to play out some scenarios in a simulation environment. And again, that's where we start with all of these tasks, is looking at what we can do to try to simulate what we think is going to happen in the future with these demand and supply changes. So push production is one of the primary things when you have an excess stock situation. Push production is one of the primary solutions that you can do on products where you know that you're going to sell those in the future and you don't have shelf life issues. You can start trying to do scenario planning on how much you can produce and what the impact of that is on your production network, but as well as what that could be for your product and your product cost. So we would, in the short term, update some hedging data, run these simulations, and then the result of that would allow us to be able to make some updates to master data around maybe assigning some new hedge attributes, putting in some transactional data such as financial hedge volume and oil consumption volume, looking at the configuration of your hedge consumption, and trying to make sure that you're covering all of your bases there. And then in the long term, try to look at using different types of hedges, a swap or a put or a call, to be able to maximize or minimize your cost and maximize your margins for this in where you have these disruptions or these chances to increase push production. So this is just an example of one of these mitigation action plans and the specific tasks that would be assigned to that. Next slide, please. Looks like we're on to you, Dan.
Great, thank you so much, Odell. I hope through the details that Odell went through, the point comes across. Next slide, please. The point comes across that it's one thing to uh, understand the impact of an issue and its mitigation strategies, but it's another whole different level of expertise required to translate that one sentence qualitative mitigation strategy into specific action plans and multiple tasks that follow with it. And as Odell showed us through the three unique scenarios, in each case, a one-liner mitigation strategy can run into 20, 30 different tasks, and they can revolve around multiple aspects, whether it's about what if scenario planning, whether it's about changes to master and transaction data, whether it's about retraining people about a re-engineered process, whether it's about changing the system configuration, and so on and so forth. So that is where the expertise is required to translate qualitative mitigation strategies into actions, plans, and tasks. And that is precisely what we are talking about here in the MSCG methodology for Agile assessment and action plan. At a very high level, we look at this into two big picture steps. One is the quick Agile assessment to come up with action plan. And then the second part is to realize those action plans with the specific tasks. So I will go through them one step at a time. The first aspect, the Agile assessment, requires the comprehension of the big picture issues and their impact. And that would relate to us understanding the scope and duration of disruptions, as well as the scope of recovery, and then what kind of resources, internal as well as external, available for us to put those action plans together. And some of those action plans are already in place at many companies. We are talking about the midterm and long-term action plans as well. And that will bring to the forefront the visibility for all the burning issues, a comprehensive assessment of all the issues, and then the financial and logistical impact across multiple business functions within a company. With the knowledge of the impact as well as the availability of resources, one can put together the plan, the activation of the plan, which would involve coming up with the details of the kind of action plans and tasks that Odell went through with several detailed examples. And that would require us to look at conventional approaches as well as some out-of-the-box thinking to translate these mitigation strategies into specific tasks. And as we realize now, given that this disruption may last for a long time, it calls for midterm, long-term plans as well as with constant revision of those. On the realization part of that, to come up with the short-term, midterm, and long-term plan, we call that as restoring to a new normal, then adapting to a new normal, and then the leading in the long-term plan. So the restoring really talks about or relates to the quick fixes and the firefighting aspects for the short-term stabilization. That can require us to do some hyper coordination with suppliers, getting the secondary supplier networks moving, revisiting our product portfolio, and so on. The midterm grouping will mandate us to look at the process ranging and change management aspects to move beyond stabilization. It may require us to revisit our procurement portfolio. Maybe it's time to look at supplier secondary vendors in alternate regions as well. And then comes the long-term aspect of it, and that would require us to revamp the risk mitigation strategies, not only update our own business continuity plans, but possibly help our critical suppliers update their long-term business continuity plans. One certainly needs to then move beyond the just-in-time efficiency aspects of the supply chains and then balance those with the just-in-case kind of resilience aspects of the supply chains, which is going to be the new normal. And how we handle that is going to be critical for the future competitive leadership in the market. The in-market for the market kind of networks where you try to now source as much as possible regionally for each region to serve the customers of those regions is going to become a crucial aspect of it. And to enhance the supply chain process maturities, all the aspects of the process supply chains, whether it's people, processes, system platforms, whether it's the policies and practices and the performance criteria, all those will have to be revamped. And that's the part of the long-term planning. Next slide, please. Yeah. Just a quick, this is where the experience of companies like us matters. We have a lot of experience in out of the box thinking and the innovations on every aspect of the scenarios that Odell walked us through. Whether it's on the demand disruption side, there are multiple things one can do. One may have to revisit different ways of disaggregating your forecast. It may have to do with for tweaking your forecast consumption strategies. Maybe a lot of your customers now may be loading up on massive sales orders as against what they used to order before, hoping that they will therefore get higher allocations than they had before. And that may require you to look at, hey, no, I can't have my regular formal sales orders forecast consumption strategy. Maybe temporarily I have to put all my customers on allocations and everybody gets similar supplies as they got same time last year, for example. Somebody who used to get 10,000 supplies may put in 100,000 order hoping to get 10 15,000 from you, but you may have to temporarily halt your normal forecasting or forecast consumption processes and put customers on allocations. One of the biggest aspects of these disruptions is the lack of visibility across the supply networks that customers have seen, and therefore having to tweak or even come up with new custom alerts or new predictive analytics and new dashboards to increase the visibility of any issues across your network. And when I say network, I mean suppliers to customers can be another quick low-hanging fruit that one can benefit from. Odell went through some great details with the hedging that we have a lot of expertise in. Maybe you have to significantly revamp your production wheel. How frequently are you going to make some products? Maybe you have gone through a significant portfolio readjustment of reducing the number of finished goods, which may also mean that you are producing some of the finished goods at a greater frequency. You may be procuring at a greater frequency. So those are all the aspects that one needs to look into. And MSCG has a lot of innovation and experience in this regard, and we can help you with that to get some quick mitigation strategies executed. Next slide, please. Last but not least, the quick takeaways for you. If you forget everything else from this webinar, a few quick things. The fact is our supply chain vulnerabilities and risk mitigation capabilities have been brought to the forefront. At least now, many of us know what was missing, what wasn't there, and those need to be fixed at the earliest possible. We also know that the bullwhip effect of these disruptions has affected the velocity of our supply chains, the variability of demand and supply across our supply networks, and also the visibility across our supply networks. And we need to get to a new normal to manage the three V's, the velocity, variability, and visibility back to where they need to be. We know that the sustained impact of this current crisis is going to depend really on how effectively we are able to flatten the curve, as they say. And that's why it may run into several months. We also know now that the priming of the pump to get all these blocked supply networks start moving again is going to be excruciatingly complex and time consuming. There will certainly be a new normal where we'll have to balance the just in case efficiency aspects of our supply networks with the just in time or just in case resilience aspects with the just in time efficiency aspects. And that will require us to have very well laid out short-term, mid-term, long-term plans, as well as sustained frequent follow-ups on that. My supply chain group has expertise, intellectual property, and methodology to help our clients with the risk mitigation and value maximization across multiple industry verticals. As I hope it came across with the detailed demonstrations, the detailed evaluations that Odell went through with the multiple scenarios. And most crucial aspect is how you manage the present crisis is going to redefine your competitive ecosystem for the future. So this is as much to be seen as an opportunity as it is obviously the problem that we are all dealing with. Having said all this, we'll be very happy to have complimentary one-on-one sessions with individual customers and to understand your pain points and to help develop the full-fledged mitigation strategies, action plans, and tasks like we have described here. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today for this webinar.
Thank you, Dan and Odell. There were two questions from the audience. Can you answer that too? The first one was, for customers, using some old technology like APO, how much can we do this scenario planning in APO? Is it limited or not? Adele?
Yes, Samir. So the scenario planning in something like APO is a little bit limited. There is some capability. We've done some of that in the past, but there are some limitations with that. One other solution that we've done with some customers is to be able to pull some of the key demand and supply chain supply plan components into IBP and be able to do some quick scenario planning in IBP and be able to tweak some things in IBP so that you know what to take back into APO.
Okay. And the second question was, which probably already answered, was can you throw some light on different industry verticals? What's going to face higher demand drop or supply situations or excess supply?
Yeah, so we've covered a few of those. Yeah, excess supply. A great example is in the oil field there. Another example is in our food network. So in the food network, we have a complete shift in the supply chain between the demand that's going to restaurants, because that has dropped off significantly here stateside, and because of the social distancing requirements, versus the amount of food that's going to grocery stores. So the grocery store demand has gone up significantly, and so it's changed that dynamic and that balance there. And in some cases, then the production facilities of the food services have been impacted, so that the supply has been reduced there because they've had to shut down for health reasons. So there's a lot of different variability that can happen inside of that whole environment. And in some companies, one business unit can be significantly impacted where demand drops off greatly, and then another business unit in the same company, we've seen with some of our clients, where demand is just going through the roof. Inside of the same company, two different business units having exactly the opposite problems. And so these disruptions are everywhere, and they each take a unique approach and a solution that Dan outlined, and we're happy to help share that with you guys.
That's it. If I can quickly add to that, some other examples of excess supply, and this has more to do with demand having dropped significantly, obviously, are the movie theaters, hotels, and the airline industry. That because of the demand drop, there is massive supply available. The shortages, as we can think of, are on some of the grocery items. There are also shortages of the biomedical devices or the testing kits or the protective wear that the doctors and nurses have to wear, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so thank you for joining this webinar. We hope to see you in a future webinar that we'll be hosting. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yep. Thank you. Stay safe. Bye-bye.